ahead and get started here. Just going to record. All right, everyone, I'm so excited for today's chat. Really, truly, I've been looking forward to this because when I had the honor of speaking with this amazing woman a few months ago to see if she would be willing to come and share her awesome with us, it was just such a delightful, enlightening conversation. And so I'm going to tell you, I found this woman on LinkedIn, and seeing what she was doing on there just really it drew my attention, and it made me want to know more, not just about her, but about what she was sharing. So we have Abla Elmi on, and she has the most wonderful, interesting background, and the passion that she has for her art of storytelling and of helping people understand stories, cultural stories, in a more honoring, authentic, and like full of integrity. This way in which she goes about doing this is just so unbelievably important, and this work is touching, and it's also very profound in that there's just so much that many of us are missing about understanding different cultures and the stories that are told in our country, in the US and in other Western cultures. So now, I would love it, Abla, if you would um, share like your bio, or just tell us a little bit about yourself, and honor us with your presence. I'm just so excited.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Mary. I'm really happy to be here with you and your community. So thank you for having me. A little bit about myself is I just completely blanked on my life story. um, I it's always hard to figure out where to start. I guess I could start by saying I was born here in the US, in Washington, D.C. I am also Canadian, and so I grew up kind of a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit everywhere. And my mom was a community organizer growing up, and that really truly exposed me to world issues firsthand. And so I think I learned pretty early on that what I wanted to do with my life is to help people. But of course, it can take your entire life to figure out how, because there's so many different ways to help people in this world. But for me, I sort of gravitated towards the, human rights and social change world. And so when I got to university, that's what I was majoring in, human rights and equity studies. But when I got there, I realized that unfortunately, nobody's reading 20-page reports anymore. So if you want to communicate with people, you have to communicate with them in the way in which they receive information. And for our generation and every generation after that, it was media. So that's sort of where I started to learn about how to utilize media, really art, media, and storytelling to get people to care about the issues that matter. Because I think stories are truly very important. Stories are how we understand ourselves. They're how we understand people who are different from us and each other, So if there's such an issue, and that's what I experienced and I encountered in my experience in both the humanitarian and in media industries, was that there's a really big problem with how the stories of marginalized and vulnerable communities were told. And the problem stemmed from the fact that it was usually people who looked nothing like us, who were coming into our communities with a story already in mind. They'd find the people they needed to tell it, and then they'd go back and package it however they wanted to, never really thinking about the ethical ramifications it would have on the people whose story they're telling. And so that's how we ended up with these negative single story stereotypes about entire peoples. So there's like for the longest time, for the continent of Africa, the prevailing image was the naked, starving African baby with the stomach poking out and the ribs poking out and the fly flying around it. And I just think about, I just can't help but think about the fact that, in 2020, we won't allow a friend to post a picture of us with a single hair out of place on Instagram. And yet somehow in this community, we've found it appropriate and acceptable to go to people in their worst moment of their lives and stick a camera in their face and then post it everywhere. which I don't think is very fair or ethical. So I started advocating really for a different way to tell stories. And I thought the solution that I came up with was that we needed to have ownership over our own stories. We needed to be included in the storytelling process. I don't claim to be the solution. I'm only a solution. I think that there's multitudes of ways that you can solve a problem, but this is like the vein that I was thinking in. And so that's what I advocated for. And I would get hired for these jobs over and over again. And every time they'd be like, rah, rah, we so believe in you and what you're doing, and we support you. But lo and behold, there's always a reason why we couldn't tell these stories differently. Sometimes excuse would be, oh, we don't have enough resources right now. Let's just do it this way this time, and then we'll do it differently next time. Or, oh, we are, up against a pressing deadline. Let's just do it this way this time, and we'll do it differently next time. And eventually, it just like this feeling just kept building up inside of me, and it felt like I was being used to re-perpetuate the same problem that I was trying to fight against. And that's when I sort of just realized, like, it just really felt like I was hitting my head against a brick wall. And it just reminded me of that quote that says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I realized that I just didn't want to wake up one day and be 80 years old and realize that I waited my entire life for somebody to give me permission to do things differently. It's like, if my life is going to be a struggle anyways, like, let it be a struggle, doing something that I believe in, and being of service and like helping people rather than being a part of the problem. So that's when I got the idea for the company that I founded last year. I was in grad school in London. I finished up my master's courses, and then I came back out here while I was working on my dissertation and founded this company. And it's what I've been doing ever since. And it's a storytelling company.
I really like, this is one of the things that, this particular group is all about having women own themselves fully, right? Be empowered and giving yourself permission to do the things that are scary, but that are needed. And so I'm so in awe of you, inspired by you, and thankful to you for just going out there and just being like, okay, instead of just resigning yourself to, well, this is how it is. And, I want to make a good living, and this is the paradigm in which you do that. And just sort of allowing it to go that way, right? Like, you're now on a completely different path,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're basically on your own road.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that we talked about briefly before when we met was just how you were kind of coming up against these white men who had been telling stories a certain way for so long. It's like, even if maybe they wanted to tell these stories, it's like they didn't even, well, one, they probably didn't even have the capacity to do so because they're the white man, right? And two, they had been doing all of this for so long, they didn't even know how to get out of their own way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And three, some of them just don't care.
Yeah. And if you just think about it, though, like, it's not just, that they're white men and that they can't tell these stories. I think if you think about it on a singular individual level, right? How can you tell a story you have no experience with? Like, you haven't experienced this, you don't understand this perspective. How can you then presume? It's one thing if it's like, you're creating a fictional world that you built from inside your own head, right?
Yeah.
But it's quite a different thing when you say, even if you're saying that you're still telling fictional stories, but you're using real life people in your stories, real life cultures, real life communities. You don't get to make up the rules then. The rules for these cultures like already exist, So how can you then go and be like, well, I decided to like place these people in my world and just completely ignore, who they are, what they stand for, like giving them a representative or authentic perspective. Like, it's just bad storytelling.
Yeah. So one of the, I'm not on Twitter, or sorry, I'm not on LinkedIn as much as I used to be. And this is where I usually see you. Though I'm going to try to be better about seeing you on Instagram as well, because that's where I hang out more anyway. And one of the things, you posted this really I mean, it shouldn't be super thought provoking, but your sort of diagnostics of certain movies, right? Like you were talking about, there are movies where they'll have somebody from another culture
Mhm.
in the movie, and it's like important,
Yeah.
or even it could be minor,
Mhm.
and they don't even have the person speaking the right language. They just speak gibberish. And you're just like, I mean, and here, as somebody who's just absorbing, watching a movie, yes, knowing that I'm watching
Mhm.
probably fiction, there are
Yeah.
still elements within a movie or a story in which you kind of, there has to be some level of accuracy for it
Mhm.
to be believable. And
Mhm.
here they're interjecting gibberish,
Mhm.
and it's representing an entire culture. And so here I'm thinking whatever I'm thinking, and
Yeah.
now I could be more biased than if I had no, you know what I mean? It was just an example, but you have them for
Mhm.
everything.
Yeah.
So if you could share a little bit about some of those things that have really, that you know, as consumers,
Mhm.
we should really be paying attention to.
See, I speak a lot about this, like, with my other creative friends. There's a double-edged sword to everything, right? Like, as a creative, idealistically, right? When I started telling stories, I started telling them first because I love stories. I love consuming stories. And it would be so cool if we existed in a world where all I do is just tell the stories that I wanted to tell and not have to worry about anything else. But unfortunately, that's not the world we exist in. And the truth of the matter is that, the less representation a community has, right? The more the little bit that does exist stands out. And so, for example, like the example that I use is I did an experiment. I'm ethnically Somali, and I grew up, I talked about it in that video, but basically the reality of my experience was I I'd never been to Somalia at that point, and I'd been born and raised out here, so I was American through and through. And the only perspective I was getting about Somalia was from the stories my parents were telling me, which were all verbal, and the itty bitty, like once in a while, like representation from Hollywood, which came in the form of Black Hawk Down. And then, like years later, more recently, Captain Phillips. Those are the two big productions. But other than that, there was this like weird phenomena that I was noticing, which was that, like I'd be watching a TV show. I wouldn't even go seeking this out. It's just a show that I like or a movie that I like, and I'd be watching it. And then I would notice out of nowhere, like they'd mention Somalia. And as a kid who had no books to like consume to teach me about who I was in that perspective, nothing to visualize, like just really truly no museums to go to, no magazines to look at, to see people who were from my culture. um like I was just like, oh my god, Hollywood knows Somalia, like, and it was so exciting to hear, right? Just the word Somalia coming out of these people's mouths. But then as I grew older, I started, like, that novelty wore off, and I started listening to what they were actually saying about Somalia. And that's when it was just like really heartbreaking and disappointing, because we were always mentioned in the context of like we were the butt of a joke. And so, like, I'd listen to this for years, and it would always happen. I'd be watching a show that had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with Somalia, and then out of nowhere they just mention it. And so what I ended up doing was, one day I just got fed up, and I was like, I want to do a very like informal, not scientific, like, experiment, right? And what I decided to do was, I was like, let me see if this is actually a pattern, or if it's just something that I'm like super sensitive to, and like maybe that's why I'm noticing it, or if this is an actual thing that's happening way too often. And so what I
Mhm.
decided to do was, I decided I wasn't going to go and search for it, but every time a movie or show I was watching ended up mentioning Somalia, whether just mentioning, like I didn't specify negatively or positively, I was going to record the moment. And then once I had enough, I was going to like look through it and analyze it and see what I found. And so that's what I ended up doing. And the results of the experiment ended up falling into two different categories. And the first category was that, Somalia would be mentioned in passing as the butt of a joke. And usually we were being called like pirates or warlords. Like that was like the joke. And it would just be like, haha, here's this one liner. And then they'd move on with the story, right? Or the absolute worst was category number 2, which was a creator would decide to not only mention Somali, but create a Somali character to place inside their show or movie. And then they would go out of their way to mention the fact that this character was speaking Somali. And then they'd have subtitles that would say like speaking Somali, and then they'd say like whatever it was they were supposed to be saying, but translated in English. But I speak Somali. And so I would listen to what the person is saying. And unfortunately, it was gibberish. It was no language known to man. It was not Somali. And that's the one that absolutely like stumps me, because I'm like, it's not like, forget about all the many layers of the problematic like way we're represented, right? Let's just look at the fact that, you know, there's no Somali people picketing outside of this creator's office saying, hey, represent us in your show, you know?
Yeah.
He or she came to that conclusion themselves and decided, you know what would be a really good idea? If I featured a Somali character in this part of the show. And so the character would come along, and then they thought with their own big brain, hey, you know what would be even better is if this character spoke Somali. And so they decided to put themselves like in this position. And unfortunately for them, Somali is a real language. It's not gibberish. It's not a language you created. So if you went to all of that effort to say, hey, you know, like I'm going to do this, and then in the 11th hour, you're just like, it's not worth like me actually making sure this character is speaking the language. And it's usually and the actors who are playing these characters are most of the time not Somali. And so it's like, what I just don't get why. Can you imagine if somebody said, hey, I'm gonna have an actor like in this movie, like, you know, speaking Chinese or something like that, and the person was like Ching Chong Chu, like that would be, everybody would be in
up in arms.
Absolutely, and rightly so. Like that's racist as hell. You know, like, but because this is a language that you don't think like, I don't know. I can't seem to speak for them, but all I wanted to understand was like why. And the truth of the matter is that, you know, storytellers have a responsibility, especially because if you're going out of your way to depict a community that really doesn't get an opportunity to be depicted on screen, and then what you're doing is you're playing into tropes and like stereotypes about this community, you're just causing further harm. Because the truth of the matter is, whether we like it or not, people form their opinions about people based on the things they see in the media, the mainstream media, in the TV shows and movies. How many times have I been on Twitter and people will be like, I didn't know this about this community. And so if you are going to feature somebody, the least you can do is make sure you don't bring or cause them more harm, you know? How hard is it to portray them as like fully realized human beings? Like,
well, and this is, I mean, the fact that we have to have this conversation, I mean, and the fact that you are bringing this to light. I mean, so many people know this, right? But maybe someone who looks like me doesn't know this. And if everything's being made for me in my consumption, then anyway, the harm is just, it was really important for me to hear you say that, because it was like, oh, of course. Great. Just a kind of another thing that I'm just kind of, me and people like me just sort of being able to just be like, oh, okay, well, that's too bad. But, you know, it doesn't really affect me. Whereas it affects you, it affects your community, it affects others, you know, and it really does affect me, but it's not like,
it affects your relationship with me.
right.
You know, if you don't have any other like example of who Somali people are, and all you hear is like, oh, they're pirates, oh, they're terrorists, oh, they're starving people, and like we never even get a character that's all of those things at the same time. You know, we're just very much a single story. That is your perspective of me. How many times have I gone out into the world and people will be like, you're not what I thought you were, and I'm just like, oh.
Yeah.
Great, you're not what I thought you were either.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. You know? So it's just, it really is irresponsible, I think, when when you do this. And I just think that the solution to this is just bring us in. Like, bring people in, even me, like, as a marginalized person, and I have so many different identities. I don't claim to speak for every marginalized community in the world, every person of color. I don't even claim to speak for all Somali people, because the truth of the matter is, whatever story I tell is just a perspective. It is not the
Yes.
perspective. And all I'm advocating for is for us to have the opportunity to, bring in like as many different perspectives, so that we get to weave this like beautiful tapestry full of, stories and perspectives that are more complex and nuanced than, we've ever been given the opportunity. So people can get to see that, like, no one community is a monolith, we're
Yeah.
all just like, we're just human beings. There's things we have in common, there's things in which we differ, and we should get to tell stories that show that.
And I really appreciate you mentioning this idea of, like if you're going to tell the story and you've decided that this is a pivotal thing, you can't just start suddenly become lazy about it. Like you have to put in the work. Like how hard is it to find somebody who speaks, find a Somali person who speaks Somali, find out the language, have that. If you don't want them to be doing the acting, then you have them teach the person how to say it, and I mean, it's really, that's just par
You
for the course.
you can have somebody learn a British accent, but you can't have them like say a language that exists correctly. Like,
Right.
it's bad storytelling. More than
Mhm.
anything else, it's just bad storytelling. That's just lazy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it's so it's just important work that you're sharing and helping others sort of see, because there's a few of the other stories that I have watched, like, you'll be interacting with someone and then you'll have them like read a story, and then at least I think and you'll have to clarify this to me because maybe I'm putting things it together, but or mushing them into one thing. But one of the things that I watched is I saw you were speaking with a woman who told the story, and then you kind of talked about how the story has been told, right?
Mhm.
Like here's the real story,
Yeah.
and or the verbal telling, and yes, there's probably nuances and changes within the different communities, but like here's how it's been told by a white, the white culture, and how very different
Mhm.
it ends up being. And
Mhm.
so just the importance of having these stories told by the people who these stories come from.
It's just it's just a better story, to be honest. Like, imagine, for example, if I decided that I wanted to go out there and like I wanted to tell what the story of like a white middle-aged widow. What do I know about that? Like, what do I know about that? I've never even married, so leave alone everything else. But I'm just like, there's no way, that's not my story to tell.
Mhm.
There's no way. It doesn't matter how much research I do. Like, I can't tell that story alone. And how much better would that story be if I instead went to a white middle-aged widow and was like, hey, how do you want to tell your own story?
Mhm.
Like, if I asked her and then she shared her story with me, automatically the story already becomes 10 times better, more nuanced, more beautiful, more human, more
Mhm.
heartfelt than
Mhm.
anything I could have created in my head. You know? You know? So like, why do we think that it's okay? Like, and that's the issue, is that, I was talking about this with a friend the other day, is that, when you're a creative, there's certain amount of ego involved in the creation of your work, because in order, for example, to tell a good story, right, you have to go internal a lot, and you have to think about, like, who am I, what am I trying to say, why this story, like, you're asking yourself, like, it's a lot of me, which is, and not necessarily in a bad way, but it's just you trying to understand, what you're trying to say. Because if you don't get what you're trying to say, your audience sure as heck isn't going to understand what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
So it's important for you to do that internal work, and you spend a lot of time thinking about what you want. But with these types of stories, you know, and it's, if it's your story, that's okay. But when it's not your story, you got to do that same thing, but with
Yeah.
another community. And it's really not that hard. And maybe it's just that I really love collaboration. I think it's the best thing ever. And your project just becomes infinitely better, you know, when you allow other minds into it,
Hmm.
um, to share your space and to work with you. But it just, it's just better. It's just a better story. And you just get to, it's just, I don't know. I love stories. And I'm consistently and constantly learning that over and over and over again. Like right now, I'm working on a project actually, that is like, it's a story about Lebanon. And I clearly am not Lebanese. And so I've spent a lot of time like speaking with like other Lebanese people and hearing their stories and things like that. And I'm just like, every time I'm just like, oh my God, this is so amazing. Because there's no way I could have created the story that we're creating now if I just came out here and was like, I'm going to, as an outsider, try and tell a Lebanese story. Like, it just, it just wouldn't be the story that it is. And I'm really proud of what we're creating, but it never would have happened if I hadn't been like, you know what? It's not about me. You know, let me put my ego to the side and let me ask these people, like, you know, how do they want to tell their story? You know?
Mm.
I don't know. I just feel like we get better stories that way.
I mean, I think that from what I've seen, it's wonderful. So, can you just share a little bit about what you like what are your hopes, not just for you as a storyteller and not for just you as a woman-owned like entrepreneur now, right? Like this is this thing that she had said, by the way, that she wasn't like going out of her way to become an entrepreneur. It just had to happen. And this what she mentioned at the beginning was, you know, giving herself this permission to be like, you know what, if this is what I'm on about, this is what I talk about, this is what I fully believe, and I'm not even living that, then shit, I got to go out on this limb. And you know, now she's an entrepreneur. And being an entrepreneur, guys, for those of you who aren't, it's no joke. It is a hard journey, and you constantly have to be growing and changing and believing in yourself and trusting in yourself like nobody's business. So it's not an easy task, you know. So I commend you on that. But can you tell us, like, with where you see and where your vision and your mission are now for what you do, like what are you hoping to gain and how are you hoping to impress upon the world with this work that you do? Like, I'm just really curious about what your hopes for this work, like, how do you want this work to impact people?
Honest and truly, like the big overall goal is to change the way in which our stories are told. Like, piece of cake, I'm out, have a good day. No biggie. But honestly, that's truly what I want because I'm just so sick and tired of, I don't know, for me personally, I hate having the same arguments over and over again. It's not productive. I'm so tired. I've spent my entire life like growing up listening to people talk about what the problem is, you know, people from all kinds of different communities talking about how they don't have representation. And so when I came up with like this storytelling method that I created, and I came up with like this idea of like how to tell stories differently, I'm just like, let's test it out. And I wanted to create a model that I hoped like could be applied in any community stories. Like, it's just like literally, because at this point, like, people make it seem like it's so complex, and for me it doesn't feel that way. It feels completely natural. Is it going to take more work? Of course, because if you think about it, you know, we've spent how many hundreds of years, you know, telling stories that cater to, you know, for example, specifically the white community, right? And there's, so right now, like as a white person, you can wake up and just know that you're going to get a nuance of stories and options and experiences, that you can relate to, right? But
Mhm.
somebody who's from another community might not have that same, might not, does not
Yes, does not.
does not
Mhm.
have that same opportunity, you know. So in order to get to that place with other communities, you have to build that infrastructure, and there's just no shortcut to doing it. But if you take the time and the energy to build that infrastructure and to build that foundation now, it's just going to get easier and easier and easier to tell these stories. And
Mm.
so basically, I think that what everybody's just, you know, from my own perspective, and this is like, quote me, don't quote me, but this is just my opinion. It felt a lot to me like people were lazy. Like they just didn't want to do that work. It was
Yeah.
all about I just want to make money now. Let me make that money and move on with my life. But it didn't feel like people wanted to do the work to correct this issue at the root of the problem, you
Right.
know? And so I was like, I just don't want to keep having these conversations. And what I realized was this whole journey for me started with the story I was trying to tell. Just a single story. And I wanted to tell it in the most representative way I could. But every single time, what I kept going against is like when I started going out there and like shopping the story around and getting feedback and learning from people and being like, how can I get this story made? I kept being told, oh, how, like the advice I got, and I kid you not, was like, I was trying to tell a Somali story, and like the advice I got was like, oh, this is well and good, but like, how can you tell the story from a Western perspective? And I'm just like, what? And like, that took me, I'm not gonna lie to you, that stopped me for a few months. And I just kept trying to answer that question. But then I realized like why that felt so weird. I was like, in the universe, in the history of telling stories, who's ever been asked that question? Who's ever been asked like, how are you going to tell this story from a Western perspective? Like a Western audience isn't going to be able to understand a story where the protagonist is a Somali person rather than like a Western person. Is that what you're trying to tell me? Like, I don't understand that. And what I realized was, especially if I'm like a new voice on the scene, I don't have the power to make sure that this story is told in the most representative way possible. And even if, say, for example, the dream happened and I wanted to tell this story as like, say, I wanted to tell it as a film, right? And then the dream happened, I wrote the story and then somebody bought my like script, right? And then dream happened, somebody was like, oh, we also want you to like direct it, right?
Ooh. Mm-hmm.
That's like amazing. But if I work so hard to protect that story and I get to that position and I only have filled those two spaces, there's all these other roles that are involved in the creation of a story. And if I haven't invested in and made sure that I brought, for example, other people with me who understood the perspective that I'm trying to tell this story from,
Mm-hmm.
then all that's going to happen is the same kinds of people are going to fill these roles around me and the story is going to be told in the same exact way. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was just like, like, that's exhausting. You know how hard it is to tell the story and then on top of that, fight everybody every
Yeah.
step of the way in trying to get this story told in a representative way. It's not even like I'm like, yo, I need a Lamborghini or I'm not gonna, do my job. I just like, can I please tell this story the way that I think it should be best told? And I'm not gonna beg you to tell my story in a human way. That's just not who I am. So I'm like, I would rather take that energy that I would have wasted fighting the powers that be and instead create the infrastructure I need. So not only that I can tell the kinds of stories I want to tell, but also that other people around me from other communities have a space, other creatives of color and just creatives from all kinds of women and just like all kinds of different backgrounds can come to this space and know that it's a safe place for them to tell their stories in their own voice, in their own way, in their own perspective. And if I've built that infrastructure not just for me but for other people, then that's a game changer, I think.
Oh my gosh, yes. That's something that I'm loving seeing everything that you're putting out there, and I haven't even seen it all, right? But I think as somebody who does love to consume stories, we all do to a certain extent, but like I'm an avid reader, always was. And being able to put yourself in these, even though, so many times it has nothing to do with your own background or your own experience in life, but because some of us are very empathetic people or people who really operate from a feeling place, you can be transported to another country and imagine what that particular experience could be like, which for me goes hand in hand with whenever I've traveled. Like I was very blessed. I mean, it was up to me, but I was very blessed that I've been able to travel all throughout Southeast Asia. I lived in South Korea. I traveled in Europe. Like I've met people, and universally, I really like people. And universally, people show up for you.
Mm-hmm.
And when you realize that people are just people, and that if you don't know what to order on a menu and they are willing to be like moo or ba, to help you out, like they care about you. They want you to have a good experience. They want you to enjoy their culture. They want you to be able to appreciate the value that you see. And so I love this idea of like really telling the stories, because when you're there, when you're with people and you really understand, like, people are people, you don't need to fear them, you don't need to think whatever you think about them, you need just experience them. And these stories are a way to do that, and the storytelling and this authentic voice is a way to do that. And it's a way for you to realize, oh, I'm having a hard time here, this is not what I understand to be true, but guess what, this is what they're telling me the story could be. But so maybe I should pause, pay attention, and learn from this, right? Versus just, oh, well, it's a story I don't like or whatever, right? Like, so I really appreciate that you are taking this on, and and it's not even that you're taking it on, it's just you're living your purpose. And by doing that, you are, in effect, like, this mission of yours is huge, and it's valiant, and I'm really, I believe in you, and I believe that this is going to become like what you want it to become, because I know, just even seeing the people you're interacting with, they want these stories to be told just like you, and they want it to be authentic and true and honest and real and like beneficial to not just them, but the communities at large, from whatever perspective they're from.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, I agree with you. I like people, which is such a controversial statement to say these days, but I do. As much as like people try to make sure I don't, I still do. And that's just the truth of the matter. Like, if you really think about it, and that's why I fundamentally like really rejected the idea that, just because a story isn't told from a Western perspective doesn't mean people can't understand it. Like, I grew up consuming stories from Bollywood, and like Nollywood, which is like Nigeria's version of that. And like, I just grew up like watching stories and hearing stories and like experiencing in real life like stories and people from different perspectives, and it only made my life better. It only made my life richer.
Yes.
And the thing that I learned is that, fundamentally as human beings, we're not that different. Like, not to erase anyone's difference.
No.
I think that, first of all, I think that our difference is what makes our world beautiful.
Oh my God, yes.
Imagine if we were all
Yes.
the same, it would be so boring. I don't want another me. Like, I'm already enough. Like, I'm already doing the most. I don't need another person. What am I gonna tell myself? I'm not trying to hear myself talk. Like, that's just not interesting to me. But I always love like getting to speak to somebody, and I just think it's so fascinating, the fact that, like, just based on a little geographical distance, we as human beings ended up creating entirely different languages and cultures and rules of life and food and ways of interacting with each other. But at the basis of all of that, we can understand each other's stories, because everybody can understand a story about, like, somebody, fighting for the love of their life, or, a kid just graduating from college and then thinking, what next? Or like, some like royal war that's happening.
Oh yeah.
Ancient this or that, and it's true, because I, for example, have like so many friends and family that consume stories from all kinds of different parts of the world. And like, my brother right now is super obsessed with this like Turkish drama. My friends are like super into this other K drama. I was watching this Saudi Arabian drama that like, ruined my life. Ruined my life. It's on Netflix, because the rules for seasons are different in other countries.
Oh.
And apparently it was like one season long, and I tried to binge it, but it had like 100 episodes. I got to like 20 episodes, and it was kind of like a soap format. Like, it ended, like, it began right where the other episode ended, and so I'm like, of course I gotta know what happened. 20 episodes in, I was like, I'm tired. I need to go outside and see if anything else is happening. I've been stuck in my room for too long. So I took a break from that show. But you know, I've never been to Saudi Arabia, like, but I was able to, like, you know, really be interested and connected with that story. And at the end of the day, you know, all we are human beings just trying to survive. And we're just living in different places and different perspectives. But you know, like, it's, I don't know. I think that is just a wonderful thing, and it's never bad. It's never a bad thing to, you know, hear stories from different perspectives. It just makes our world richer.
Yeah. I really, again, I appreciate this because, you know, I think a lot of what I've learned. So I'm in Minnesota, right? I'm in Minnesota and I always had this feeling something didn't feel quite right. But now I know exactly what it is from what has just kind of exploded. Like it was a feeling, it wasn't something I knew, like in my head. And so now it's really interesting to be like hearing people say like, oh well, you know, Abla, you know, you're different versus like yes, okay. So and I, you know, I always knew that doesn't make any sense. However, that's kind of how things have been portrayed. And so when you talk about when, you know, hearing you talk about these stories about people from Somalia, in Minnesota, we have a huge Somali community. And in Minnesota, I live very, very close. And yet it's so far. Like I have Somali people very like in my neighborhood and it's so divided and yet at the same time it's so celebrated because we have we want to be a place that's a harbor, but yet having that division is just such a it's no fun. But the piece I wanted to add is that when I have had the happy accident of being able to interact with the Somali people that I have met. Everyone's lovely, you know, and sometimes there's a language barrier, but I've only had wonderful experiences, you know, and so it makes me sad to hear, well, you know, hey, it's never portrayed right in media and TV and whatever, right? Or even on paper. And I just got to see an amazing art exhibit last year that was talking about, hey, this whole like I don't know, exodus. I don't remember the words that they used, but they were telling the story of how the Somali community came to Minnesota, and it was just so interesting and fascinating. And I'm just thankful that they had a safe haven, but obviously a safe haven double-edged coin, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I appreciate you sharing all of this because you know we have to learn that there's much to learn about each individual, and you can't just assume that you know anything if
No,
you just know one story or just know one human.
no. No, the thing is that, you know, in our country, we treat difference like it's a bad thing, you know? And like we really preach assimilation. And I really dislike that term because I'm like, how can you, on the one hand, I grew up hearing, you know, from American culture in society that, you know, you should stand out, you should be different, you should be unique, and da 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 da. But like when you're hearing it from directed at people who are from a different ethnicity, it's always, oh no, you should just take on our culture, our beliefs, and you should just assimilate, you should be the same as us. And it's like, but we're not the same, and that's okay. Like you and me may not be the same, but like two like white people are not the same, you know, like
Yes.
different human beings, you know, like you have different perspectives in different ways. Somebody from rural America has a different perspective from somebody who grew up only in the cities. Like, you know, like it's just, we're not the same. Nobody is the same. And it's okay. And our world would be boring. So we shouldn't be afraid of difference. Like, honestly, you cannot tell me you want another you. Like, that's just not what you want. You think you want it, but it's not what you want. I promise you. And we have to be okay. Like, and something I really like learned and I just wish to pass on to other people is like, we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's okay. Are we gonna make mistakes? Absolutely. I'm the queen of mistakes. All I do is make mistakes. I fall down. I fail a lot. Like, but you know what? What matters most is not the mistake you make, but the decision that you make after it. What is the exact next thing that you do? That's what determines who you are as a person, right? So you messed up and you said something ignorant. What are you gonna do in the next step? It's like, are you just gonna get defensive and just like try to gaslight the person who you hurt? Because at the end of the day, like imagine if this person was your friend or somebody you loved, right? For me personally, I don't enjoy hurting the people that I love. I don't enjoy hurting strangers, period. That's just not who I am. And so I would want to make it right, you know? That's my next step, right?
Yeah.
And I would, and even if my intentions were not to hurt somebody, I'm not God. Like I'm just a person, you know? I like it just like gives me chills at night to think about the fact that like I could hurt somebody. Like I really don't want to do that. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, I'm not an angel and I will hurt people. That's just that's just the truth. Intention or not, I will hurt people. And so all you can do is just own that and apologize and try not to do it again, you know?
Right.
And just that's just how you operate in life is you hopefully try not to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Just make new ones, you know? And then eventually you get to a place where you're like, hey, like it's not as bad as I thought, you know?
Yeah. I This has been such a lovely time with you. I just, like I said, I really do. I feel so blessed to be able to have this time with you and chat. And I guess the kind of wrapping this up, because you have lots to do, um, what would you want people to get from this discussion and to do next with, like, do we want to instruct them, go to Instagram, go to Twitter, do this? Like, tell us what do you want people to be doing since
Mhm.
after meeting you and hearing from you and learning about what you do.
Well, if you wanted to join me on my journey, I'm currently in the process of building the company. It's not like fully launched yet, but I got some really great advice from a friend who, when we were discussing, like I had a project that I wanted to release and I was discussing whether I should release it under my own personal name or if I should release it under the company name. And it really fell in line with the brand that we were building. And she's like, you know, straight white dudes get to get funded based on an idea, you know, but we women spend a lot of time having to prove that our idea works before anybody gives us a chance. And so she's like, why not? Like, she's like, instead of building everything and then looking for your audience, why don't you just start putting things out there and let your audience come on the journey with you? And so that's sort of what's happening on my page. As I've already made the disclaimer, I'm not perfect. There's a lot I'm still learning myself, but I'm having a lot of fun doing it. And I'm really set on building this world. And so if you want to join us in this world and this journey we're on, you can find us on Instagram and on Twitter right now. We will be coming to other social media channels in the future. Capacity, you know, one step at a time. Rome was not built overnight. So if you want to join us, you can find us there at Elmi House. And I think the Mary will share.
I did post it. So I want to take it a step further. Like, how can we be supporting you? Like, what is the best way? Like, if we go and we enjoy these stories and we think what you're doing is awesome, how do we support you? Like, how do we support you and the cause?
Oh, well, if you want to support us, for example, in a few weeks, I'll be launching our Patreon page,
Okay.
which is the next step for us, because we are in the process of, like I said, building, and building takes coin, unfortunately.
Mhm.
And I wanted to also share, you know, the behind the scenes look at how we will put these stories together. And what I'm really, really proud of is that every story that I've worked on thus far has included, you know, the community whose story we're telling. And so
Mhm.
that's extremely important to me. So anything that you guys were to give us would go out again into these projects that we're building. We're working on building our work portfolio because, of course, inevitably after you know, talk about like, this is what I'm doing, and you showcase it on your website and all that stuff, inevitably people want to be like, oh, can I see some of your work? And so that's what we're in the process of doing. And we're working with some really phenomenal people from different parts of the world, even, and even parts of America. So it's pretty awesome. And so there will be more about that like announcement like soonish in the future in our page. So you can support us that way.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you so much for just ripping the Band-Aid off and being completely true to yourself and giving yourself all the permission. I'm just going to reiterate, just keep doing it because I know it's hard, believing in yourself and trusting that this is all going to work out, right? I just want to remind you that you're going to have to do it all the time. And we're here loving on you every moment, even when it feels hard and sucks. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. I so appreciate you. And I'm excited to see what you continue doing.
Thank you, Mary. I really appreciate your support. Again, thank you to your community for having me. It's been lovely.
Yay!
Yeah, and just thank you. This is very Canadian by the way of me. Like we say sorry and thank you so much.
Especially as women.
Yes.
Yeah. No, you just be like, yeah, good on you for having me on.
Yeah.
Right? Good job. Yep, that was a good choice. Good choice.
I've been trying. I was like just talking. My friend was like yelling at me for how often I say sorry for no reason. And then I was like on the phone with her as we were talking about this, and we were at the airport, and literally there was a book that literally the title of the book was just saying, "Stop saying sorry." And it's like, even the universe is talking to me.
Yes. You need to end that. There's no reason. Yeah.
All right.
Wonderful. I'm gonna stop this now.
Okay, bye.